La la, do, do.
Singing in the shower.
Hey, get out! Who said you could get in here?
Get out! Get out!
Hey, wake up. Hey, wake up.
Hello and welcome. If you are new to my channel, my name is Thomas Azar, and I want to share the most important, the most transformative and practical things to know as you study piano pieces. You're about to hear me say, you have to do this, you have to do that. And I know that's very irritating. I feel irritated when people tell me I have to do something. But I really care more that this information is relayed to you in a clear way. And it's just true. So forgive me for saying you have to do this, you have to do that. But you do. And I do too. The quality of your thoughts is everything when it comes to studying music. You have to understand why it sounds the way it does. You have to understand what the music is doing. You have to know what the composer was thinking when they wrote it. We also need to take into account our brain and the way it optimally learns. Your brain will not remember random bits of information. It will only remember information that it deems to be meaningful, useful, and interesting. I am currently finishing up learning the Sarabande from Bach English Suite No. 2, so I'm going to take you through the process of how I memorized it. You can use this process with any piece of music. It's important to not start memorizing the music on day one. Step one is to create a crude wire structure of the large points of your piece in your mind. Allowing this step to be crude is important because on step two, when you start making it uncrude, it is this specific process that is one of the secret ingredients which allows you to build a stronger memory. So on day one, look for the most broad and general features. Aim to see the skeleton. For example, in my Sarabande, I noticed it begins in A minor and modulates to C major in the first half. Then the second half does the opposite. C major modulates back to the home key of A minor. You can take note that the relationship of these two keys is that they are relatives. They share the same key signature. Bonus points if you come back at a later time on the same day and do a first revision of your crude map. Correct anything you misnoticed the first time. But keep in mind, this is supposed to be a crude wire structure. Don't make it too detailed yet. Never learn piece by piece or you will forget each piece. You must learn as if you were adding pieces to a whole or integrating more information into the whole, or survey the large picture and gradually make sense of it. You have to be surgical with the level of details you notice, and you have to approach it from micro-analysis and macro-analysis in order to have full command of the material. You have to know it as if you are the composer. You have to know it as if it is your child. Create a wire structure or skeleton first. Get the big picture of your piece before moving on. Now let's switch gears to a cool idea. Let's talk about cognitive overload as a strategy. Imagine you are constructing a net and you want to take a sample of things from the ocean. Do you think it would be better to construct a large net with wider gaps or a small net with smaller gaps? It depends on your objective, right? But if you construct a larger net with wider gaps, that may take an element of fearlessness and trust because you don't know everything you need to know about a subject. But you'll capture larger ideas. And our brain is remarkable at filling in the gaps with surprising accuracy and success. Don't get distracted by all of the small details right away. Construct a wire structure for the entire movement you are learning. Trust that the details will fill themselves in on a subsequent phase of study. This is a trap where most people fail. When you come back to those details at a later date, the general framework will give you a better idea of how these small details relate to the whole, and you will learn it not only faster, but with more of attention and mastery. Ask lots and lots of questions about the music. Tell yourself stories about the music. Choose your favorite spots and draw a little pencil heart on it. A what question is less potent and effective than a why or how question. Ask more why or how questions. Another tactic is to come back and revise what you have learned, make improvements or corrections to your mental model. If you do this on the same day, this step will be more effective. The longer you wait to make your revision step, the less effect it will have on your encoding and retention later on. The reason for this is when you sleep that night, your brain will encode your model. You will have a more accurate as well as a stronger mental model if you have created your initial analysis and first revision at a separate time in the same day. The word practice means to use information you know. But in the beginning of learning a piece, you don't know the music yet. So at the very beginning, it's not called practicing, it's called learning. On your first day of memorizing a new piece, it may feel like you have remembered nothing or very little, but your brain actually encoded more than you think. So trust in this process, keep at it for several days, and you will see that it becomes easier to memorize the more you persist. Be sure to have a positive attitude and encourage positive emotion on those difficult initial days, as you want to feel more optimistic overall. To summarize the answer, in order to be able to retrieve the information during your performance, all of that information has to be related to the big picture. It cannot be a series of meaningless, isolated notes and chords and events. Each small piece of information is an integral piece of the larger structure. And even piano pieces exist as a part of the largest structure, which is the exquisite and absolutely priceless body of piano repertoire we are so privileged to have. The reason that I point that out is you will see tons of similarities when you compare your pieces by our various master composers. They do many of the same things, and they do also have their individual quirks and eccentricities, which tend to be very attractive if they are famous and if they have survived historically through the years. The next day, you want to look for the kinds of specifics I'm about to discuss and begin to add in some details to your skeleton. Okay, I'm about to do an explanation of the parts of a triad, the definition of an appoggiatura, the parts of a minor scale, tonic and dominant, and some different cadence types. If you already know these kinds of things, feel free to skip ahead about 7 minutes, and you don't need to hear the explanation of that.
I know I keep saying this is my favorite video yet, but I think this one really is my favorite video so far. This one, so I'm going to take you through memorizing. And right now I'm memorizing the Sarabande from the Bach English Suite No. 2. And it's pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy about it. So I thought this would be a good example. But before we get into the music, I'm going to list off a few basic things that will help us to memorize this piece. And these basic things will also apply to other pieces. It's not only going to be applicable to this. So the first thing is we have triads, right? In music, we have triads, and each part of the triad has a name. The bottom, the lowest note of a triad is called the root. So whenever we talk about this note, we use the label root. The middle note is called a third, and the top note is called a fifth. The third is a third above the root, and the fifth is a fifth above the root. So you can see here we have an A minor triad, A, C, E, and that is the first triad in the Sarabande. All right. Now, one thing you'll notice right away is that the C is on top. So Bach understood that if he takes the C and moves it to the top, you end up with a sweeter sound. So this is a particular voicing that sounds like this. And imagine when you have a mango, if you take a bite of the mango, you'll taste the peel and that doesn't taste very good. But you cut the mango and open it up. Now the sweetness on the inside is on the outside, and you can easily taste the sweetness of the mango. It's just like that for triads. We want the middle of the triad to be the highest sounding note, and you can really hear the sweetness of the third. Another concept we're looking for is something called an appoggiatura. Appoggiatura is a note that is not part of the chord moving to a note that is part of the chord. So it's a classification of non-chord tone. In this case, F is a non-chord tone, and it resolves down to E, which is the chord tone. We will see multiple appoggiaturas in this saraband, and other composers use appoggiaturas everywhere. It's a way of making the piano cry. It's a very expressive device. It sounds like crying. Okay, it's also a way of elongating a harmony so that it doesn't just last this long, it can last this long. So a lot of music composition is finding ways to prolong a chord progression, prolong a chord. That's a lot of what we think about when we're composing music. We want to decorate and prolong. All right, so let's take a look. Here is our A minor scale. The A minor triad is built on the first note of the scale. And so we call this, you can call it the one chord. You can call it tonic, which is home. Every time we hear this sound, you want to think of it as if you're returning home or you're beginning from home. And the other chord we want to pay lots of attention to is the 5 chord. A lot of times we will add a 7th. So you have a root, a third, a 5th, and a 7th. That's why we call this a 5-7. It just gives this chord a little more richness, and it has more tendency to want to move back to the tonic. Okay, so these are our 2 key players in the key of A minor. You have the tonic, which is A minor, and you have E7, which is the 5-7 chord. And in minor, we generally sharp the 7th note of the scale. In this case, it's G. You'll notice it's also sharped over here. That's the same note. And the reason is we need this chord to be major. All right, so let's look at a few cadence types. So if you have your 5 or 5-7 moving to 1, that is called an authentic cadence. So at the end of a musical phrase, or at the end of a section, we oftentimes have what's called a cadence, which is a resting point in the music. So it comes to a stop, and then you might have a breath, and then a new idea will start after that. Here's another kind of cadence, a 2 chord moving to 5, or really any chord moving to 5 is called a half cadence. So if the music pauses and stops on a 5 chord, you have this sense that it's not fully resolved. And that's why it's called half cadence, because it's halfway home, but it hasn't fully, it's not the authentic. It's not coming back to the tonic. A plagal cadence is 4-1. This is also known as the Amen cadence. So at the end of hymns, Amen. That is a 4-1. To me, this is a softer, a more feminine cadence. This one is a little stronger, a little more strident. And so I think of this as a masculine cadence, and this one is a bit more feminine. Finally, I wanted to show you about a deceptive cadence. So you have 5, we think it's going to 1, but it doesn't. It goes to 6, and this is a surprising sound. Mozart loved this, Beethoven loved this, Bach loved this. It happens everywhere. So when it happens, you want to notice it, and you want to not spoil the surprise. Make sure that the 6th chord sounds like a surprise. So in your head, you're thinking 5, 1, no 6. Instead of 1, you're going to play 6. Make it a big surprise. Okay, this is one of those things that sounds very simple. It's very effective, and it's hard to explain because it's a little bit weird. It's called a cadential 6/4 progression. What it is, if you notice, we've got our tonic there, preceded by the dominant, and preceding that is another tonic, but the E is the lowest note. So we call this the 6/4 chord, since from E to C is the interval of a sixth, from E to A is the interval of a fourth. And this chord sounds like it has a dominant quality to it. And we call it a dominant prep chord because it goes to the dominant before finally resolving. So just the fact of having this low E changes the sound of that chord so that it prolongs the dominant sound. And this happens not only in the saraband, but it happens all the time in all of music. So I wanted to be sure and include it in this discussion of memorizing because it really helps a lot to know this. We'll talk more about this in the future again.
The sounds of the music are in direct correlation with the concepts of the theory. So something like a deceptive cadence, for example, isn't just a title we need to memorize amongst a list of other labels, but it has a very specific sound. And if you fall in love with that sound, and it's really cool, and spend some time admiring the cool effect it produces, you will much more easily assimilate the information into your mind, and therefore your musical life.
So on the second day of looking at this piece, you want to come back through and notice you have an A minor triad. The C is on the top. Now I'm going to have two appoggiatura, two notes which move to B diminished, A minor in second inversion, which goes to the dominant, and this is a deceptive cadence. It's going to F major instead of A minor. Okay, so what I've noticed so far is it's A minor with the C on top, two appoggiaturas go to B diminished, A minor in second inversion, going to the dominant, and a deceptive cadence. Now it's a big wide A minor chord. This time the third is on the bottom. And so I want to notice that that's the third of the chord. And on the top is the fifth. So train yourself to hear what a fifth sounds like. That's the fifth. And so the third to the fifth. Train yourself what that sounds like. Two appoggiaturas on top. This is B half diminished 7. Appoggiatura to the dominant. So this was dominant to the tonic. That's the tonic with a passing tone, F major, G7, and G7 is where we start to change keys. Now we're about to have C major. Okay, so these are little stepwise patterns. I want to remember C major and move down a step. This is one of those just gorgeous, gorgeous moments of Bach that many people cannot hear because they don't know what to listen for, but this kind of sound, it's just utterly fantastic. So I drew a little heart on this place because that helps me remember it. I remember B, G, C, D. Yeah, you could think of that as a cluster chord, but Bach thinks in terms of chord tones and non-chord tones. And then I'll skip to the end Here, what I found to be the most helpful for my day 2 learning is the left hand. I've got okay, so 2-note group, CB. Now I'm thinking of the FA third. So 3-finger pattern. That's the CE third. B and G sharp third. F sharp. Now the dominant, octave, tonic. So that's easy for me to remember. I'm just thinking. And from there, I can start to build on the right hand. So on my first 2 notes, I'm thinking C major. So even though there's lots of extra notes, it's important to know what the chord is. This is C major, going to F major, and back to C major. So it's going to sound like this. Right? But instead of thinking of all of those notes, which is the worst way to memorize that, and that's how I would have tried to do that in college, you're supposed to think of the chords and think of how the notes are relating to those chords and moving around those chords. One more thing to mention here is I have 2 seconds, 3-2, 3-2, and then I'm going to have a 4th, which I'm using finger 1 and 4 to play the 4th. And so the point I'm trying to make is that your finger patterns help you to remember the intervals. Finger 1, 4, another 3-2 for a second, another 1-4 for another 4th, and then it changes to something else. So the pattern of the fingers really helps you to remember the pattern of the notes a lot of the time. A lot of the time when we're playing the interval of a 4th, we will use finger 1 and 4 or 2 and 5. Those are the most common options. There are exceptions, but it's important to know the rule. And when you have an exception, that actually helps you remember it because it's an exception to the rule that you've already learned.
The key to being able to retain a large quantity of complex information is the ability to interact with that information in a meaningful way. I recently saw a piano YouTube video, and the guy recommended repeating a measure 7 times. But there was no mention about the content of the information or the meaning of the information. And this is the absolute worst kind of learning. We could call it a low order of learning, because the brain doesn't know what to do with the information, and so it's going to be easily and quickly forgotten, if not immediately forgotten. Your brain is a massive consumer of energy. It is great at purposefully forgetting information it does not regard as important or meaningful or useful. Okay, this is a huge point. Absolutely huge. If you aren't passionately, desperately interested in the music, and I mean what the structure is and why it sounds the way it does, you will have a very hard time remembering it. Your brain is an expert at forgetting. It's a survival instinct. Your brain actively erases information each time you sleep. It will only encode and retain information it deems to be absolutely imperative to remember. So as you practice, you have to love the music you are playing. Why do you need to study theory? Know your chords, know cadence types, know composition devices like voice exchange, cadential 6/4 progression, etc. Because this is the framework you will rely upon to interact with the structure of your pieces, to really know them thoroughly and on an intimate level. It is possible to learn and play a piece and not know what's going on in the piece. But it's much harder to do, and the final result does not sound good. A big reason we need to discuss this is that most people who practice piano are highly inefficient. They spend a great deal of time and effort, and don't get good results. Let's define deep learning as the ability to make more meaningful connections. Try to speak to yourself in nonverbal terms as much as you can. We have multiple hemispheres in our brain, and you will activate more than one hemisphere if your conception of the music is mostly nonverbal or includes many nonverbal facets. Try drawing a picture of your piece. Use colors and shapes to represent the various moods. When I studied at Piano Summer in New Paltz, the students sat on a stage at a performance by Alexander Slobodyanek, and his music was quite colorful and drawn on. Do not fall back on what you already know, but instead always try to learn something new from it. This is a great strategy to combat having weak spots in your pieces where you are likely to forget something. If you learn using the same process each time, you saturate out the amount of learning that can be done from that particular mode. Always change the mode of learning, the same structure. This can be skeletonizing, it can be playing backwards, it can be changing the phrasing, change anything, or just simply notice different things about the structure, such as harmonic elements versus melodic elements. Here is another opportunity. The process of recall is a great strengthening device. If you can't remember something, resist the impulse to grab your book for reference right away. Instead, invest 10 seconds or 20 seconds and try to remember it this way. If you do, it will now be established in a much stronger way than if you had looked at the book. Continue to do this and your memory will be quite strong after some time. In order to memorize music, you need to know a lot of theory. You need to be able to recognize the various things that are happening in the music. What key is it in? And does it modulate? Where and when and why does it modulate? What are the phrase structures? What are the patterns that make the phrase? Are any of the events unusual or things we wouldn't normally expect? These can be things like a deceptive cadence, Neapolitan chords, augmented sixth chords. Our task is to go from having nothing or not much to think about to thinking about quite a lot. Playing notes which seem to have no meaning or reason stands in our way. For example, voice exchange. You can hear them and you can think of them as you play. This is how you want to think of all structures. Voice exchange is a bit easier because it's more obvious. We have to work to make others as easy.
After you've completed stage 2, which is looking for things like cadence types and key areas, and you feel pretty secure with the notes, stage 3 is time to stress test what you know. So one idea for this is, instead of playing where the music is written, move your right hand up an octave, left hand down an octave, and this will challenge your brain because it doesn't sound like it normally sounds. If you don't want to do it, that's probably a sign that it's a good way to stress test. It should be a little uncomfortable. Another good way to stress test is just touch the keys without playing and see if you can remember which keys to play, but you don't hear the sound to confirm. So this just demands a little extra from your intellectual capacity.
Writing lots of notes is counterproductive. It reduces cognitive load, which is a level of confusion in the brain. This confusion is actually a key part of the learning process, and our brain is very well evolved to make sense of confusing information. I used to think that I was bad at memorizing. I thought it takes a very long time and it's really hard. But I've realized that I was wasting a lot of time in the past. And there are certain mindsets which simply don't work. An obvious one is mindless repetition. That is the worst one, and it definitely doesn't work. But also trying to force the information into your head to simply remember it does not work. This comment is for me and people like me. Do not allow yourself to daydream while you are practicing for memory. You have to stay mentally engaged with the information and love it more if you want to truly master it. Well, that was a lot of fun. I wish you the best of success in memorizing your music, and will you please come back and let me know how it's going? Let me know how these ideas worked for you. Bye.
I'm not a mute, I'm just a string of shells. I'm no mute, just used to speak too soon. Keep your talk, it's you who vermin I hate. Keep your shrieks, I